My mother's estate attorney used the phrase equitable distribution 3 times in a single sentence on the day he read us the will. I remember thinking, equitable means equal. And then I looked at the line item with my name on it, and I understood that my family had been using a different dictionary than the rest of the world for 41 years. I am an estate planning attorney. I have sat across the table from hundreds of families in the worst weeks of their lives. I have watched brothers stop speaking over china cabinets. I have watched daughters dissolve into grief, and sisters harden into something that no longer looks like sisters. I count things for a living: what's real, what's owed, what was promised, and what can be proven. I did not cry at the reading of the will. What I did was open the Notes app on my phone and begin typing. Welcome to Family Revenge Stories New, the channel where quiet people keep the receipts and family learns that boundaries have a price. If stories about dignity, documents, and consequences are your thing, drop a comment and subscribe. This one is going to take a while. You'll want to stay. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that for the last 11 years, I practiced estate law in a mid-sized firm outside Seattle, which means I have spent more time reading the legal architecture of families than most people spend reading anything at all. I know what testamentary intent looks like. I know what it looks like when it's been interfered with. I know the difference between a family that grieved together and one that had been rehearsing a different ending for years. My parents were Gerald and Miriam. They met in Juneau in 1979 when my father was working pipeline logistics, and my mother was teaching second grade in a school that smelled like wood smoke and rubber boots. They built a life in Alaska slowly, the way you build anything in Alaska, with stubbornness and an awareness that the land does not owe you anything. By the time my brother Devin and I were born, they had a house in Anchorage, a modest investment account, and a cabin near Talkeetna that my father had framed himself over 3 summers. The cabin was the thing my father loved most that wasn't a person. It was not a luxury property. It was 400 square feet of hand-laid logs on 12 acres, with a wood stove that worked and a generator that was temperamental. The roof needed replacing in 2009. The well pump had been on borrowed time since 2017. But the land was pristine. 12 acres of boreal forest with a creek that ran clear even in August, backed by a view of the Alaska range that made every other view I'd seen in my life feel like a photograph of a view. My father died in March of last year. Pancreatic cancer. He was diagnosed in November and gone by March, which is how that particular disease works, fast enough that you don't finish your sentences before it takes the person. My mother had died 3 years earlier. A stroke sudden in her kitchen. She'd had her estate in order. She was that kind of woman. Her will left everything to my father. He revised his own will the following spring. That revised will is the document this story lives inside. I want to tell you about Devin before I tell you what the will said because context matters. Devin is 7 years older than me. He left Alaska at 22 and did not come back except for Christmas, and then only sometimes. He lives in Miami in a house he bought with money that had, over the years, passed through several LLCs and 2 ex-wives. He sells commercial real estate. He is good at it. He is good at the same things my father was good at: charm, momentum, the ability to walk into a room and make everyone feel like the room just got better. My father loved this about him. I think my father recognized himself in Devin the way parents sometimes do, which is to say, with a blindness that looks like love. I flew back to Anchorage 4 times in those 4 months. I coordinated my father's hospice intake. I managed his medication schedule when his cognitive function began to slip. I sat with the hospice nurse on a Tuesday night in February going over the morphine protocol, while Devin was at a conference in Phoenix, and texted me that he was keeping his phone close. I have the hospice intake paperwork. I have the medication logs. I have the timestamp on that text from Phoenix. I keep them not because I plan to use them, but because I am an attorney and I document the way other people breathe. I am mentioning this because it is relevant. Everything I mention is relevant. The will reading was on a Thursday, April 18th. Devin had flown in the night before and was staying at the Marriott, which I mention only because I had offered him the guest room at the house and he had declined without a specific reason. The attorney's name was Harold Breen. He'd been my parents' attorney for over 20 years. I had met him at their kitchen table twice. He was competent. He was thorough. And on that Thursday morning, He read my father's final will and testament in a voice that was professionally neutral and explained, clause by clause, what my father had left behind. To Devin, the house in Anchorage, which had been appraised at $620,000, plus the investment portfolio, $1.6 million in managed accounts, plus the Porsche that had been my father's one concession to vanity. Total at fair market value. Approximately $2.2 million. To me, the cabin near Talkeetna. Harold Breen paused at that point the way people pause when they are reading something they know will require a moment. He said the cabin had been appraised at $78,000 for the structure and improvements, on 12 acres of land that the county assessor valued at approximately $114,000. $192,000 total, against $2.2 million. I set my pen down on the legal pad in front of me. I had been taking notes. I stopped taking notes. I looked at the window. Harold continued. He said there was a personal letter attached to the will, addressed to both of us jointly, which he would provide copies of at the end of the reading. He said he was required to read one clause aloud, and he did. I leave the cabin at Talkeetna to my daughter because I know she is the only one of my children who will understand what it is. Devin made a sound. Not a word. A sound. I wrote the clause down verbatim, word for word, on the legal pad. Then I turned to the second page Harold slid across the table, and I began to read. Slowly. The way I read every document, once for content, once for what's missing, once for what I was meant to assume but cannot prove. This is the part of the story where I need you to understand something about how estate documents work. A will is a public document after probate. Trust is not always. My parents had both. Harold explained that the will was the surface document. It established the distribution of the named assets. But there was also a family trust, established in 2004 and amended in 2019, that held additional instruments. One of those instruments was a promissory note. He slid it across the table. My father had loaned Devin $340,000 in 2016 for the down payment on his current Miami property, the one that had since appreciated to just over $2 million. The promissory note was signed and notarized. It carried a 2% interest rate. It had not been repaid. By the terms of the trust, this note was now a liability against Devin's inheritance, meaning the $340,000 plus 6 years of interest at 2% was to be deducted from his distribution before disbursement. Harold clarified. This was not optional. It was not a forgiven debt. My father had specifically instructed that the note be enforced at the time of distribution. He had written that instruction in his own hand, in a codicil dated December of last year, 2 months after his diagnosis. Devin said. He told me that was a gift. Harold looked at the notarized promissory note and said nothing. Picked up my pen. The second revelation was smaller in pages, larger in everything else. In the personal letter, the one addressed to both of us, my father had included a single paragraph that was not instructions. It was not legal language. It was just a sentence he wanted us to have. Harold handed us each a sealed envelope. I opened mine at the table. Devin folded his and put it in his jacket pocket. The sentence in my envelope said, "The cabin knows the difference between someone who visits and someone who stays." I'm sorry it took me this long to say so out loud. I read it twice. I put it back in the envelope. I did not look at Devin. I drove back to the house alone. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table where Harold Breen had once sat across from my parents, and I read every page of the trust document 3 times. 3 weeks passed. Devin did not fly back to Miami immediately. He stayed. This surprised me until it didn't. He was calling his own attorney. I knew because his attorney called Harold with a question about the promissory note's enforceability, whether the 2% rate constituted a legitimate arm's-length transaction, or could be characterized as a gift with inadequate documentation. Harold told him the documentation was thorough. I know this because Harold called me to advise me of the inquiry, as the other interested party. That is what you do when one party challenges an instrument. You notify the other. I wrote the date down. 2 days later, Devin came to the house. He arrived at 11:15 a.m. on a Saturday. I know because I had the Ring camera on the front door. And the timestamp is there whenever I want to see it. He came inside. I made coffee. He sat in the same chair Harold Breen had sat in. He looked around the house, my father's house, the house with my father's furniture and my father's books still on the shelves, and he said, "We should list this by June. Spring market." I put my coffee cup down. He talked for 11 minutes. He talked about the Miami market and how his contacts could move the Anchorage property faster than a local agent and how the investment accounts were going to take time to liquidate, but he had a guy who could advise on the tax exposure. He used the phrase estate money 3 times. He said, "The cabin isn't worth dealing with. You should just let it revert to the trust and take a cash equivalent." There is no cash equivalent provision in the trust. I said, "What did Dad's letter say?" He looked at me. I said, "The letter Harold gave us. At the reading." "What did yours say?" Devin said he hadn't read it yet. I looked at him for a moment. Then I said, "Okay." He waited for me to say something else. I didn't. He left at 12:32 p.m. I have the Ring timestamp. That afternoon I called Harold. I said 3 words. "Send the letters." If you have ever watched someone who couldn't manage a single phone call during 4 months of hospice care suddenly become a logistics expert the moment the estate opened. If you have ever watched entitlement move that fast, you already know where this goes. Stay with me. We're not done with the receipts. The letter Harold sent on my behalf was a formal notice of my intent to enforce the promissory note in full, consistent with the terms of the trust, with interest calculated through the date of distribution. It also noted my intent to retain the Talkeetna property as specified in the will, without pursuing a cash equivalent, and my objection to any informal distribution arrangements discussed outside the probate process. The total owed on the promissory note, with 6 years of 2% interest, was $381,840. Devin's attorney responded within 4 days. The response was, functionally, an argument that the note should be forgiven as part of equitable distribution, and that the disparity between our inheritances justified an informal rebalancing. I read that letter at my kitchen table and I thought about the word equitable. Harold filed the formal probate petition. The promissory note was recorded as a trust liability. The process was going to take time. Devin knew that. His strategy, I understood, was to drag it long enough that I would compromise. He called me a week later. He was not aggressive. Devin is never aggressive. He is warm and persuasive, which is worse. He said he felt like Dad hadn't understood what he was doing, that the cancer had affected his judgment, that the codicil from December was suspect. I said, he also called me the week he signed it. I have the voicemail. Devin was quiet. I said, he sounded like himself. More quiet. He said there was going to be a gathering, some of my father's friends, some family, his wife Karen, her sister, a few cousins from my father's side who had stayed close. He said everyone wanted to come together and sort this out, as a family. He said it would be at the house the last weekend of the month, and he hoped I would come. I said I would be there. I spent the next 10 days doing what I do. I pulled every financial record I had access to as co-trustee, which was all of them. I requested Harold's complete file. I obtained a copy of the December codicil with its notarization chain. I pulled the hospice records. I was listed as the primary care coordinator, which meant I had full access. I printed the medication logs. I printed the call records. I printed my flight itineraries. 4 round trips, Anchorage from Seattle, all of them logged. I printed Devin's text from February, the Phoenix conference one, and I placed it behind a tab labeled Availability. I put everything in a manila folder. Black tabs clearly labeled. I brought the folder to the gathering. The house was full by the time I arrived. My father's friend Carl was there, who had known him since the pipeline days. 2 of my cousins, Robert and James, who had been close to my father in a quiet, consistent way. Devin's wife Karen, who is not a bad person, just a person who had been married to Devin long enough to absorb his version of every story. Her sister Bet, who I had met twice. A few others. There was food on the kitchen counter. Someone had brought a fruit tray. Someone else had brought those little sandwiches cut into triangles. Devin was in the center of the room, holding a glass of wine, being warm and magnetic the way he always is. He hugged me when I came in. He said he was glad I came. He meant it, I think, in the way people mean things when they believe they've already won. They gave it 30 minutes. There was small talk. Carl told a story about my father that made two people cry. Then Devin cleared his throat and said he wanted to say a few words. He talked for 6 minutes. I timed it. He talked about Dad. About the family. About how none of them would have wanted things to go this way. He talked about Dad's wishes. A phrase that appeared 4 times. And how what Dad really wanted was for the family to be taken care of equally. He said the cabin was a sentimental asset but not a liquid one. And that it wasn't fair to leave his sister holding a property that needed $60,000 in deferred maintenance while her brother walked away with a managed portfolio. He said he wanted to make it right. He said he proposed a split of the investment portfolio that would give me an additional $300,000 in cash, in exchange for releasing the claim on the promissory note and accepting the cabin as full settlement. He had taken the $381,840 he owed and turned it into an offer of $300,000. He had framed owing me as generosity. $300,000. Released from a debt of $381,840. Karen nodded. Her sister nodded. 2 of the cousins looked uncertain but did not speak. I looked at Carl, who was watching me. I said, "May I have the floor for a moment?" Devin said, "Of course." He said it with a smile. He thought I was going to cry. I could see it in how he shifted his weight, the slight settling, the readiness to be magnanimous. I said, "I want to go through a few things. It won't take long." I set the folder on the dining room table. I opened the first tab. I said, "This is the promissory note my father had Devin sign in 2016, notarized and witnessed, for $340,000. This is not a gift instrument. It has a 2% interest rate and a demand repayment clause activated by death of the lender." I turned it face up on the table and slid it toward the center so people could read it. The amount currently owed, including interest, is $381,840. Devin said, "Dad told me." I said, "I know what he told you. This is what he signed." Second tab. This is the codicil my father added to the trust in December of last year. It was signed 8 weeks after his diagnosis, on a day when he was not yet on any medication that would impair cognition. The notary and the 2 witnesses have both provided affidavits confirming his capacity. Harold Breen has copies. I set it on the table. He specifically instructed that the note be enforced. He wrote that in his own handwriting in the margin with his initials. Karen said he was sick. He wasn't. I said, "He called me the day he signed it, December 14th, at 2:17 in the afternoon. We talked for 40 minutes. I opened the third tab. This is the call log. The room was quieter. Third tab. These are my flight records. I flew to Anchorage on November 22nd, January 8th, February 3rd, and March 2nd. That last trip, I did not leave until March 19th. That is 17 days. I set the printouts on the table. These are the hospice intake documents, which show me as primary care coordinator. These are the medication logs, which show my signature on the administration record 17 times over the course of 2 weeks. I opened the next tab. This is a text message from February 4th at 9:47 p.m. It is from Devin's number to my number. It says, "At a conference in Phoenix but keeping phone close. Let me know if anything changes." I set it face up on the table. Carl looked at it. He looked at Devin. Devin said, his voice lower now, "I had commitments." I said, "I know." I said it without heat. "This is not about that. This is about the document that says he owed $381,840 and an offer to forgive that debt in exchange for $300,000 and a release of my legal claims. That is not equitable distribution. That is an $81,840 discount on a debt, offered in exchange for legal silence." Someone in the room made a sound. Bet, I think. Devin's voice changed. He said I was being cold. He said Dad would not have wanted this. He said the word family, the way people say it when they mean it as a threat. I said. He left me a letter. Everyone went still. I took the envelope out of the folder. I had put it there on purpose behind the last tab. I did not unfold it entirely. I read one sentence. The cabin knows the difference between someone who visits and someone who stays. Nobody spoke. I looked at Devin. I said, I'm not releasing the note. I am not taking the cash offer. The distribution will proceed as written, with the promissory note enforced in full. Harold will complete the probate on schedule. Devin stood up. He said, and I want to quote this exactly because I wrote it down that night. He said, "You are making a mistake that this family will not forget." I picked up the folder. I said, I know. I closed the folder because everything in it had already done what it needed to do. Carl walked me to my car. He said, he knew you'd be the one to hold it together. He meant my father. He said it without elaborating, and I did not ask him to because I already knew. I drove back to the house alone. I sat in my father's chair by the window for a long time, looking at the shelf where his books still were. Probate closed in September. The promissory note was enforced in full. $381,840 was deducted from Devin's inheritance before any distribution was made. His net inheritance, after the note, after legal fees, after the costs of the challenge he had filed and subsequently withdrawn, came to approximately $1.71 million. Still more than mine by any number you run. I want to be precise about that because I am always precise. My inheritance was the cabin. 12 acres. A wood stove that worked and a generator I have since replaced. I retained a structural engineer in August. The deferred maintenance, new roof, well pump, foundation grading on the north side, came to $58,200. I paid it. I went up in October, the week after the repair crew finished. I drove the park's highway north until the mountains filled the windshield and there was nothing else. I built a fire in the wood stove on the first night. I sat in the chair my father had built from birch he had cut on that same land 22 years ago, and I read the letter again, the whole letter, not just the one sentence, and I understood that he had been trying to say something for a long time that he did not have language for until he was dying. Devin did not contest the final distribution. His attorney sent a letter that Harold described as notably quiet. He did not call me after September. Karen sent a text in November that said she hoped I was doing okay. I thanked her. She is not a bad person. Robert, one of the cousins who had been at the gathering, he called me in October. He said he had been thinking about that day, about the look on Carl's face when he read the text from Phoenix. He did not say anything else of substance, but he called. I noted it. Carl came to the cabin in November. We had coffee. He told me more stories about my father in the early pipeline years, things I had never heard. I wrote some of them down after he left. The letter lives in the top drawer of the birch desk my father made. I have not framed it. It does not need to be framed. It is a piece of paper in a drawer and I know where it is, and that is enough. In January, I contacted the Talkeetna Historical Society about a small grant my father had discussed before he died. A reading program for kids in rural communities that needed books. It was something he had mentioned to me in November, in the first week after his diagnosis, when he was still himself completely and thinking about what he wanted things to mean. I funded it with the money I would have spent on flights back and forth to Anchorage if the probate had dragged for another 6 months. It didn't drag. So the money was just there. The program is named for my mother. The small plaque at the library says her name and the year. It does not say anything about the rest of it. It doesn't need to. I have been asked, not often but occasionally by people who hear pieces of this story, whether I feel guilty, whether I think I was hard on my brother, whether I think my father made the right choice. I am an estate planning attorney. I have sat across the table from hundreds of families at the worst moment of their lives. And what I have learned is that a will is not a surprise. Not really. A will is a document that says what was true the whole time. It says who showed up. It says who borrowed money and called it a gift. It says who signed the medication logs at 2 in the morning and who was at a conference in Phoenix. My father knew the difference between someone who visits and someone who stays. He just needed a document to say so. If this story reminded you that quiet people keep the receipts, that calm is not the same thing as weak, and that the people who absorb and adjust and show up without asking for credit are not obligated to absorb forever, take that as yours. Update what needs updating. Say what needs saying. The documents are already telling the truth. Sometimes we just need to read them 3 times. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.